Hey everybody, Tom Barnes stories from the 78 going to Uptown. And this particular story, I have my friend Diego Baez with me. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you.
So you're a new writer as far as having something published, right? You put a book of poems together, but you are a professor in city colleges of Chicago. That's where I'm talking to you from in your office there in Uptown. But that wall behind you there is the manuscript of this book. Why don't you talk about it in your background growing up in central Illinois, which doesn't sound very unique in terms of where people grow up, but you had a different view just because of what central Illinois is typically thought as. But your point of view with your family being two kids of that were brown in a sea of white, right?
Yeah, so much so. And it doesn't seem as unique, here in Illinois, we're used to having Chicago and then we got downstate. And that difference,
Which
is
is way
pretty
different.
it's pretty marked. But I tell you, growing up in the downstate portion, we don't we it's so silly how little access many of us, like my family in particular, but many of us have to the city and it's the different demographics. So like growing up in central Illinois, yeah, it was, I mean, it's wild now because I've lived in Chicago for 14 years now. And so my
Mm-hmm.
default is just walking around town. You see people from all walks, speaking all languages, different, races and ethnicities and nationalities. And it's not like that in Central Illinois. And so it was certainly strange. I guess it was strange to have a father who's from Paraguay, which is a tiny country in South America,
Mm-hmm.
and my mom, who's from Pennsylvania, she's white. And so my brothers and I actually have two younger brothers. They get kind of consolidated into one character in the book, in Yaguarete White. But so much of the book tries to kind of, I don't know if it tries to reconcile with those differences so much as it just like steps into them and explores them and tries to play with them a little bit. Because so much of my growing up was defined by like not knowing or like having questions or like being confused a lot actually. Because we also didn't grow up with like really anything of a Spanish language speaking community like Latinidad. uh, Certainly there are immigrants and folks there. Most of them are from Mexico or from Central America, but our the way it's funny, even for a small town like that, it is still pretty segregated, where you've got still people just kind of stay in their parts of town. Um,
Yeah.
and so that was just like just such a left such a mark on my childhood and who I am today that it had to surface in the book.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, I spent time in central Illinois in Bloomington Normal. Illinois State University is there, and that's where I went. And I know exactly what you're talking about. I spent many, long winters there, right? Going to school. And myself, I'm half Polish and I'm half Mexican. So, one side of the family, you have the very Polish Chicago traditional side. And then the other side, you have basically first generation. My mom was born in Mexico, then came to the States, and they did their traditions as if they were in Mexico, but they did it on like in a little village in Chicago. So
Yeah.
the dichotomy between one family event to then another was really weird for me to understand because then I would go to my friends' houses and they would all just be Irish or German and celebrate Punchki Day, and we were celebrating quinceañeras and all that. So I imagine you had to grapple with a lot of that in broadening your scope of like what the world is like outside of central Illinois.
Yeah, and I will say one, I think I knew it at the time, but certainly now I look back on it as a real privilege and a gift, was how frequently my dad insisted that we visit, that we fly down there together as a family. And so we went every 3 or 4 years. We would go like during the winter break between, fall and spring, and we'd go for like a month because it's a long journey. And I think his justification was like, if we're gonna go, we're gonna do this. We're gonna live there for like a month and then we'll go back. And as a kid, that was it was confusing for sure because we fall asleep on the plane, wake up, and it's summertime, and there's all these people
Yeah,
around. None of them speak English, not really, but so many of whom are family, and it's a big family down there. So many of whom, I mean, really, all of them would embrace us as if we were just another other primos, and for sure the language barrier was tough when we were kids, and I try to write a little bit about that in some of the poems, like how we as kids would find our way around the language barriers to still bond and still come up together, even though we're separated by continents and languages and cultures. But then as we all of us kind of grew up and aged, they started to learn English. I speak for myself. My brothers, I don't know if theirs is any good. My Spanish got better. It's still not great, but it's like I can kind of hold a conversation.
sure.
And so like bridging those slowly, like over a long, long time, years and years and years, and then finally getting to a place where like I could look at both sort of what was going on in Paraguay as being unique because it is different to quite a few other South American countries, and certainly the traditions and like the rituals and even the holiday celebrations are there's a lot that are not celebrated in Mexico and a lot that are celebrated in Mexico that aren't celebrated in Paraguay. And so like
Hmm.
even going to college and then eventually going to grad school and then moving to Chicago, I still I still haven't been to a quinceañera. I've never attended one
Well,
because
my
like
daughter's got one this year, so you're invited. How about that?
I'll
August
crash it.
18th. Keep it on your calendar.
Seriously though, it's like I even say that out loud right now, and I'm like, that's wild because I have
That
a
is
daughter.
wild.
She's only 4, so we're pretty far from that. But like, those are the kinds of interesting, I don't know, just like funny things that I try to write poems about because I don't know how else to think about it.
So what made you want to do poems? As far instead of like, a novel or another way of doing a blog post, people do all these things like a poem is like the old school way of doing things, right? Like what made is it just like the romance of sorry, a romance of a poem?
I feel like poetry has always spoken to me. Even as a kid, well, I remember very clearly again in Central Illinois in like seventh grade, eighth grade. I remember encountering two different authors, I guess you could say, lyricists, who really shaped my understanding or just my appreciation for the possibilities that poetry has or presents. The first was Edgar Allan Poe,
Oh yeah.
classic. But the closer I looked at his rhyme schemes and the more time I spent with them, the more I realized, like, oh, you can actually do some very creative and elaborate things with where you're putting your rhymes. It doesn't just have to be the end of each line. But then, like at that same time, Eminem's album, his first album, came out. His first full length album came out, and I was blown away. I mean, I probably should have been listening to that in seventh grade, but some questionable messaging. But the wordplay and the humor and the daring and like there's something sort of like that persona, the bravado of the persona, it was all very appealing to me. And like to have those two things kind of come together at a really formative time, that would have been when I was like 12, 13, that's when we're starting to kind of form our first impressions like, well, who am I not as a kid? Who am I as like the adult I want to become? And I mean, I can trace it back to then because ever since then, I've just been very interested is maybe too light of a word, like obsessed with writing lyric poetry.
That's fantastic though, because I feel like when you figure out a way to um as you go through it and discover what you like and who you are, you develop your voice, you develop whatever that is, however poetry or video or blogging, what have you, journaling, even some people just journal and don't release anything to the world, but you did, and you also found a way to weave in a little of the native language as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky because my Spanish I already mentioned is okay at best.
Hmm.
Uh, but with Guarani, the indigenous language in Paraguay, it's nothing like Spanish. I mean, obviously they're not related. And I know some words. I know it's like some vocabulary. And I'm trying to learn more. I have a 4-year-old and I'm trying to impart some of that to her. But the truth is that I don't speak it well. I don't blame my dad for not teaching us. He says that he tried, and it's kind of the classic like first gen immigrants conundrum where it's like, and he and I we've talked about it a bit, but I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's like, do you teach your kids the language of your people, knowing that that might cause them challenges in assimilating or just becoming normal or whatever, or do you not, because of whatever reasons? And according to my dad, we were really we we were really whiny about it, and we wouldn't want to talk about it. We would just kind of resist at every turn. And that breaks my heart now, looking back, because I too now, when I do speak to my child in Spanish sometimes, and she understands it, she'll play along, she'll go along with it, but sometimes she will say, like, I want to speak in English, or she's like, I don't want to speak Spanish. And it breaks my heart a little bit. I'm like, oh my God, this karmic payback. This is
Uh-huh.
like, it's hard. And so I can't live in that place of like blaming my dad for not teaching us. I have to then instead decide, what do I want to do with the language? And like, one thing I can do is put it on the page. And I can put it on the page in ways that I hope kind of recreate for other folks, for readers, whoever hopefully will pick up the book. If they also struggle with some of the terminology, if they also struggle with some of the language, they're kind of reliving that experience in some way.
Yeah, I've had said very similar experience with my mother teaching me Spanish when I was a kid, and I was in a very white school, and kids made fun of me. And I came home and said, "I'm not doing that anymore." My mom's like, "Okay," and now I'm like, "Oh, I must have broke her heart." And it breaks my heart knowing now as an adult that I did that to my mom, who is like the sweetest woman on the planet. Excuse me.
we we got to forgive ourselves. We have to.
Yes, we have to move on, and you do so by honoring your father's heritage, legacy with this book, and your mother's. I mean, you are who you are because of your parents together, right? And that it spills out on the pages and the words you use in your book of poetry.
Mm, I hope so. I know that. So I called the book Yaguarete White, which in retrospect is like, could I have chosen a more difficult to pronounce title for a book? But whatever. But so the Yaguarete it derives from the a Guarani word for jaguar. And then the white, I needed to include that part of it, because not only am I interested in that part of my parentage, like you say, like my mom's side of the family, not only would it be disingenuous for me to like disavow that and like pretend that that wasn't a thing, because it very much
Right.
did inform a lot of how I move through the world and the privileges that I experience. And but it also, I'm interested in like larger larger questions of how whiteness operates, both here in the States, both within myself and the people I encounter, but also in Paraguay, and trying to both bring those, like jam those together, sure, in like the figure of a speaker who is very similar to myself, but also in the book, hopefully in some certain instances where it's a little more, uh, I don't want to say open-ended, but more open to interpretation, I guess.
Fair enough. And I think that's the beauty of art, right? People can use it however they need to for expression, for a place of solace, or a place of healing. And that's the beautiful thing about art, and how what an artist intends and versus what people receive. It's a beautiful discussion within the ether, if you will, and how you take things as you are when you hear something or read something, right? Like I've had that with poetry or with songs, which are basically mini poems just
Yeah.
put to music, right?
Oh yeah, totally, totally. It's a thin line between the songwriter and the poet. Like it can be very interchangeable.
You have some events coming up where you're going to be speaking and talking about the book, I believe February 22nd, 29th, and then March 28th at certain areas around the city, right?
Yes. So I'm really excited for all of them. And they're all free and they're all open to the public. So next week, Thursday, on the 22nd, we're doing an event here at Truman College in the theater, where it'll be really, it's just supposed to be a celebration of poetry and music. So we've got a harpist who will come and play some songs. I'll read some poems. There will be some light refreshments and good community. Nothing too too terribly fancy, trying to keep it kind of grounded. Like it felt right to do it here at Truman. I've been here for like 12, 13 years now.
Hmm.
Feels like home, feels like a good place to kind of host a thing like that. So, but that said, it is open to literally anybody who wants to come through. The event the following, I believe it's, yeah, that must be the following Thursday, will be at the beautiful Independence branch of the Chicago Public Library over there in Albany
Hmm.
Park. And I, thankfully I've had the pleasure of being in there and kind of touring the space, and it's incredible. So Jacob Syons, who is a Chicago poet as well, he'll be joining, and I think Pablo Ramirez will be able to join as well. I'm very hopeful because these are folks whose work I admire. They have, it's funny, like sort of similar, not topics necessarily, but drawing on their heritage as well. There is some similarity there in Latinidad, but then within each of our individual experiences, just totally different styles and approaches. So that should be very cool. And then there will also be um, doing an event at Women and Children First bookstore in
Hmm.
Mexico in March, later in March. And that'll be very special to me for two big reasons. The first is that Women and Children First has been my home, my bookstore home on the north side for as long as I've lived up here in Uptown, and now I live in Rogers Park. But it's just such a crucial, like, neighborhood community cultural spot. The work they do there is great. The titles they carry are excellent. They've got a good children's section as well, which is nice. But the second reason that particular event will be very important to me, or just very special to me, is that my editor at Booklist, which is a publication that reviews books for librarians. So, like, the idea is, it's not like, oh, this is the best book of the year, or this book is trash. It's more like, here's a book, here's what it's about, here's who might like it, so the librarian
Mm.
can then figure out how to help people find it who might like it. And so my editor, Donna Seaman, she has been instrumental in connecting me with authors and events and just like lit culture and community in the city. And I'm very grateful that she'll spend an hour or so just talking with me about that stuff and the book at Women and Children First. It's like an ideal situation. I couldn't imagine a more enjoyable conversation in that particular location at that time.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And if people want to know more about you or information about your book, what's the best way for them to find all that information?
Yeah, the best way will be either through my website. It's just my name.com, so diegobaez.com. I try to keep it updated as much as possible. And for someone who used to work at a web design agency, I'm having to relearn a lot of things. But then social media as well. I've reestablished my social media presence to try to have answers to some of these questions, and also to connect with folks. So
And one final question: as a person who clearly has a day job, right, and you did other things prior, how difficult was it to actually just start to put this entire project together? Because I've been thinking about it for years, but it's always one of those things where like, next week, next week, and then all of a sudden you're, 5 years later, like, oh wow, hey, am I going to do this or not? I mean, I imagine with the family and everything else, you found those same struggles.
yes, absolutely. And it's funny, what you say there, like, oh, I'll do it next week or next week, and then the weeks turn into months and the months turn into years. I mean, that's literally the story here with me. And I think about this a lot. Some folks will come out of their college experiences or their graduate experiences, and they'll have a book, they sell it, and off they go. That was not my experience. I was somebody who needed to take some time with the writing, and then just kind of slowly over, yeah, many years, putting individual poems together, then starting to think about how they speak to one another, and then thinking about maybe this becomes a book, maybe this kind of congeals into something that lives on its own, or all the poems live together on their own. And it took, yeah, I mean, some of these poems I drafted like 12 years ago, a little while ago.
Wow.
But I will say, you mentioned family, and for sure it gets more taxing on time with the family and a little one. But I tell you what, the book was mostly put together by about, like, most of the pages up there were put in place in like 2017, 2018 or so. But then my child was born in 2019, and so much of the book, so many of the poems are interested in inheritance and legacy and heritage, questions that before my child was born, I was just thinking about kind of in one direction, right? From my father and his father before him, and my mother and her mothers before her into me. But when my child was born, that just opened a whole new door to like, whoa, now the questions are about it's almost there's two, it's like almost like a two-way street here now, because it's like, what am I giving to my child and what am I passing down to her, at the same time that like I have to admit I also am taking things from her, even if it's conceptually, because she's in the book and there are poems about like having a child that I couldn't have written, not very well, I don't think, without actually having a child. And so in 2019, 2020, a whole new dimension of the book opened up, which in that regard, I think I do believe this. And I have to kind of say this, but I also think I believe this, which is that the book doesn't exist the way that it does without her in the world. And in that
Mm.
way, I'm grateful, I suppose. I'm grateful that I didn't have the same kind of opportunity to publish the book in this format, because it would have been a different book. It would have been like half the book, you know? And so now it does feel like it's most realized thing, even if I'm not the young, clear-eyed, clear-eyed 20-year-old anymore. I'm, a little bit older, but wiser, I suppose. We'll say wiser.
Yeah, and you have maybe a little bit better of a story to tell at this age in life versus when you were in your 20s, right?
I think so. I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Diego, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for just sharing your story and talking about your family and getting behind the writing a little bit and literally in front of it with the writing on the wall behind you there. So I appreciate it very much. And we'll see you at one of the three events you got coming up here in this late winter, early spring.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.